about a crash retrieval. When was the first time that you were aware of a crash, either Roswell or any other crashes here in the United States?
Well, the first I knew about it was about around the beginning of '47 when I came back from World War II. And I had, in intelligence sources, there was reports that said that UFOs had crashed in different parts of the world, and they were buzzing our planes and so forth. I know about it then, but I didn't know about the Roswell crash then. I learned about the Roswell crash when I was stationed at Fort Riley, Kansas, and I was the duty officer that night. That meant I was in charge of the security of the whole area, including the inspection of the guards, every place where they were. So I went around about 2 or 3 in the morning to the veterinarian area, because we had horses at Fort Riley. And one of the sergeants that I knew was a sergeant of the guard. I used to bowl with him. And I told him, Sergeant, how's everything going? They told me at headquarters that this area was very secure. He said, yes, come on, Colonel. He said, I want to show you something. So he took me back in the back room, and there was 5 crates. They looked like crates there. Lifted up a tarpaulin on one, I did, and here's this body there. At first I thought it was maybe a child, because it was only about 5 feet, shorter than 5 feet. It looked to me. And it was floating in fluid. And then I took a good look at it, and this lasted about 10 or 15 seconds only. And I figured, what is that? And the stomach sort of turned. But that was usual, because in combat, when you see people killed, your stomach sort of turned. But you have to recover fast, especially if you're an officer in command, you have to keep going. I did the same thing that night at Fort Riley. And I covered it up, and I told him, Sergeant, be careful, this is very careful, I don't want you to get in trouble, get out of here. And I'm not going to put it in my report at all.
Okay, what did this, can you describe what this body that you saw?
Yes, I'll describe it. It looked like it had spindly, sort of legs were not big legs, they were sort of spindly. The arms were sort of, I saw 4 fingers, I saw no thumb. And the chest was small, sort of, and the skin looked sort of grayish color. And then the head was large for the proportion of the body. Not real big now, but large. And the eyes were both slanted, sort of. And they had about a half a filament on them, and no nose, no ears, no mouth, just slits. So I covered it up, and I figured to myself when I was walking away and outside, I better not say anything about this. I don't know what it is. I have no idea what it is. So I figured operate in the intelligence manner. Hold this in reserve, put it up here someplace or back here. Maybe in the future I'll get some cooperation and be able to evaluate this, but not at the moment. I don't know what it is. So I promptly put it back in my head and forgot about it.
Okay.
Then 10 years later, I was at Fort Riley, I was at White Sands, commanding the missile range. Well, at the White House I kept getting reports, but none of them tied in definitely to this experience. So at the head of White Sands, my own radars were picking things up, items going in the air, 3,000 or 4,000 miles an hour. And I had radars, pencil beam, which would lock on the targets. They were good radars for the day. And I was the only, my battalion, the only one had radars that could read altitude. The Air Force couldn't even in those days. These were modern Nike radars. And in later stages, to show you how important it was, I started getting atomic warheads. So I figured there's something up there traveling with this speed. What are they? So, like a good soldier, I reported to higher headquarters. Answer back was, forget it, I'm not interested. Don't report anymore. Well, that's figuring out that way, good. Then when I get reports in the future, I tell the boy, deliver the tapes to me. Because we had tapes that would record the whole foreign sequence. And I checked the tapes and I figured, well, this is accurate. What the boy said was true. There's something up there flying around that's beyond our technical capability. We have nothing that can go 3,000 or 4,000 miles an hour and break the lock that quick on a radar. Especially these radars which locked on the targets.
But how did you know, how do you go back to seeing what you saw and relating it to Roswell?
Well, let me tell you a little later now. Let me continue on this. So a few years later, I had some experience in this, that there were something like they called extraterrestrials. So I figured maybe this was one of them. Then when the General Trudeau reported to him in the Pentagon, and he told me before he was going to send for me as soon as I got back, because I commanded the range in the missile in New Mexico, and I was Inspector General of 7th Army, my second tour there. So I reported to him, saluted him, he said, "You aboard, Phil?" I told him, "Yes, sir." He said, "Good, watch things for me, the rest I don't understand." Now, it's the only orders he ever gave me, because that's all I did in the White House staff, he sent me there. So he called me in one day, he said, "I'm going to make you chief of point in Health Division, and you're going to inherit a 3-drawer file. I want you to go through that file and look what's there, and you give me a program and tell me what you think they are." So I take this file in my office, downstairs from his office, on the second floor in the Pentagon, and I open it up and I start finding this material, which he called later, of course, it was junk file. And it was a bunch of wires, which I didn't even know what they were, which were emitting colors. I didn't even know if they were wires. I had this chip, this integrated circuit, a laser instrument. They could do like some of the fine cuttings that they said in animal mutilations. And I had also fiber optics, something, I had those. And no, we called them, we started that because one of my, and I had the reports on autopsy that performed at Walter Reed on our lab, which we financed at Walter Reed. And when I read that, it matched with what I saw at Fort Riley 14 years before. The whole autopsy was similar to what I'd seen. So then I started putting 2 and 2 together. And gradually these items would start coming. Then the general called me in and said, "Work out a program. Find scientists and engineers who are working on these things and shove them in there." I told him, "But General, I have to study these things a little bit because really," I told him, "I'm not that bright. I don't know what a lot of these things are, but they're important." He said, "Well, Phil, they are important. Give me a program what they are." So asking questions, talking to industry, talking to scientists, I finally came up with a program for the general which he was satisfied with. He said, "Okay, start it working. You're in charge. And keep me informed." So I started getting into these things, and I had some idea. I wasn't sure what the chip was. Integrated circuit in those days, a little beyond me. So I started talking to people, and I figured, well, this must be important. So that went, the write-up, and it went to Bell Lab. Then I had an instrument, also, which I didn't discuss in the book. And like a human, I figured, well, it won't come on, it'll look like a little flashlight. The battery must be dead. Of course, there was no battery in it. That was thinking in this world's terms. So one day I went down to our lab at Belvoir, and I told the boys there, I know them very well, we went in the lab and they were doing some work on radiation, that damn thing came on. It was an instrument, and you run over the body, it would blink, and it had 2 dials on it, which lit up. But another instrument. But beyond that, getting back to the body, so when I read the autopsy, I went to the general. I told him, "General, I've seen one of these." And I started describing it to him. He said, "Put it all on paper, Phil, and give it to me." So we put it down. I put it on paper. And he said, "I got Phil." He said, "What do we got? What are we up against here?" I told him, "I don't know." He was a very religious guy. He used to go to retreats at Loyola. And also, he was the kind of man that took his helmet off and got a sergeant's helmet before Charles Hill went out and fought with his men. So when I started putting all this on the extraterrestrial together, we finally gave it a name. I told him, "It looks like, these are clones." And so the name came out, extraterrestrial biological entity. That's what we figured they were. We better describe it. We never used the letters ET. There was no such thing.
You said that they look like clones.
They were clones. Not look like clones. They were clones. We figured that they were created by some other intellect. And we also came to the decision that they were made specifically to travel in space. Because we knew even in those days man could not travel in space. His bones are affected, his muscles are affected, his brain is affected. Man cannot travel in space. So we came to the conclusion these creatures, whatever they are made to travel in space. And gradually, through the work we did, we found out that this integrated with the flying saucer, and really, because most of the failures in making flying saucers were the guidance system. That this creature was also the guidance system, was part of the engine of the flying saucer. And gradually I got into a lymphatic system, the lungs, and that thing on the movie, people asked me, but I thought, well, there was some truth to that, because they pulled out an eyelid, and no one knew about that eyelid. That eyelid was a light gatherer, so they could see in the dark. They had a third eyelid.
You mean the autopsy copy?
Yeah.
You're referring to?
No, the autopsy that I had said about the third eyelid, and this autopsy was on TV. I don't know if you see, but they reached over and pulled an eyelid out. Now, no one knew about that. And people have asked me, what do you think of it? I tell them, well, I have to give it some credibility because I saw 3 things on there which people don't know about. And only I know about them because of the autopsy, and I'd seen the creature.
Now, the creature you saw at Fort Riley,
Yeah.
did you ever discover where that came from?
Yes. The sergeant asked, sergeants talk to the drivers. The drivers told him that this thing came from an airfield in New Mexico and was going to Wright-Patterson. The sergeant told me that the drivers of the 4 vehicles told him that. So that's where I knew where they came from and where they were
So the airfield we're referring to is Roswell, the 509?
No, I wouldn't call it Roswell, but I knew about 509, the atomic weapons. And I figured, then I started looking in other papers, and I found the references of the crash in Roswell. I figured, well, it had to come from there.
What were the 3 things? You said the eyelid was one, the lens. What were the other 2?
The brain, it had 4 lobes in it, different from ours.
And the third thing?
The other thing were the striated muscles, to be able to travel in space.
And were you able to see any of that in the autopsy film?
Well, no, I didn't have an autopsy film.
No, the autopsy film shown on TV.
Yes, they had it in a sort of a container, and the brain was in there. And it looked like the one that was described in these documents I had.
I want to get back to the crashes. Did you see, you talk in your book of a number of different crash sites throughout the world. I'm more interested in 1947, around that period of time. Were you privy to any other crash sites in Arizona, New Mexico?
I was privy to the St. Augustine crash. And there was another crash right down in Mexico. There were 3 crashes I was privy of in this area. Of course, I didn't keep track of those because I told all the people they asked me, did you see the UFO? I told them, I'm not interested in seeing the UFO. I'm interested in what's inside that UFO.
That St. Augustine crash, could that have been crashed at Socorro instead of St. Augustine in that area?
No, it wasn't Socorro. It was down St. Augustine. Because what I did, I got a map, and Roswell came through my area through Trinity site and keeps on going and to the St. Augustine area.
Okay.
My headquarters of the Red Canyon Range Battalion was the northeast portion on 280 there at White Sands. That's where I was located.
There was a crash purported to happen in White Sands itself in 1948, in September of 1948.
There was some talk about something down at Kirkman or Holloman in that area. I never know about that.
So you never had really a need to know until after a period of time had passed, until the general gave you orders to look at this junk, and then you looked at the autopsy.
Exactly. Even at the White House, I used to get reports because I had all the clearances. I didn't have what you call a need to know. I had all the clearances. So the documents were available to me to look at and read. I had crypto clearance, I had NSA clearance, satellite clearance. I had all those clearances. In fact, the general told me, I want you to have every clearance that I have.
The people that were aware of these and recovered them, did they feel that there was an international, worldwide threat to our safety?
No, I never got covered like that. We made our decision right in the Army, in RMD, that there was a threat to our safety. because we kept track of a lot of the incidents that happened. And they were overt incidents. They wrecked some of our planes. At Malmstrom Air Force Base, they knocked out the guidance system of every missile, the same item they knocked out. The Germans used to do this to us in Europe. When we overran the place and we overran the factory, they would take out, since if they couldn't destroy it moving too fast, they would take the same part out of every machine so that you couldn't cannibalize them. And this was the same thing.
I'm going to change the shot.
Okay, and she's going to change the shot real quick, and then I'm going to ask this question. In any of the recovered craft that you were aware of, being in the Army, were there any weapons, and when you're ready?
Go ahead. I'm
Okay.
recording.
When any of the crashes occurred, and you were in R&D, were there any weaponry found on these crafts? Were there any weapons that would...
No, the damage was caused by electromagnetism in those craft. No weapon. We came across no weapons. A laser we came across, but it wasn't exactly a weapon. It was a cutting tool like it.
They had no offensive weapons that you could find?
Not that we could find, but the damage was caused. We knew this.
Okay, could you state that?
There was no weapons as we saw in the flying saucers. But the weapon that they did have was electromagnetic type weapons which could knock out our guidance system, knock out our missiles. In fact, von Braun even said that they threw our missiles off a trajectory. A strong electromagnetic influence from that, because I think this was our guidance system, could knock out our missiles, our Minuteman missiles, which were our deterrent, knock out guidance systems. And in fact, we had some reports from Russia, the Baikonur, the Cosmodrome. They flew over 14 seconds and all their towers fell apart. Then later, I discussed this same issue, who was the expert on that, was Wilbur Smith, the Canadian genius. And he told me about atomic binding coming loose. And it comes in pillars, and they get magnetically charged. Now, if you remember the Roswell thing, Roswell said the night before, the night that happened, there were lightning storms, and they kept hitting in one spot. I asked Wilbur Smith about it. He said chances are that these moving pillars, which he said would also cause fires, charged this pillar up so hard, he said that the plane landing committed would disintegrate it. And he said, I think that thing was so charged up that they came through their gate, and when they hit it, they were surprised and they crashed.
I have two more questions.
Okay.
I've been doing a lot of investigation in the field of crash retrievals, and Dorothy Kilgallen's name keeps coming up. She was also involved in the Ruby case. Did you ever have a chance to meet Dorothy Kilgallen?
No, I never did. I never knew her. I met a lot of the reporters, like Edith Roosevelt was a columnist. I met her, and I know people. I never met Dorothy Kilgallen. I'm familiar with the story about Dorothy. Her demise is sort of questionable because of that.
Okay.
No, I never did meet her, unfortunately. I wish I would have.
And the last question that I want to ask, besides the ETs coming here, are you privy to any information about abduction cases? Is it the ETs that are still coming to this planet that are abduction, or do you have any idea?
That was part of one of the things that we held against them.
Could you state?
About the abductions, that was one of the things that we said that you're mistreating our people, and one of the overt acts that we thought that they were doing. Now, we never got into abductions in the Army, because after all, our primary mission was the competitive edge of the Army and, number one, weapons. And we decided that this was not our area of abductions. We'd leave that to psychologists and medical people who were trained in that, in the other services, like the Surgeon General, and that wasn't really our area to look into. So we watched it. Yes, we had records and all these, and I read a lot of them. And I thought there was a lot to it. But we had our hands full in what we were doing, like is in the book. And we never got into that because we figured that was a whole area beyond us. We weren't trained for that, really. And we couldn't make any Because the descriptions those people gave in some of those things, and I tell you all this, the descriptions they gave of the extraterrestrials match us, which they don't know about. Which never got out.
That's,
We need to wrap this up.
Yeah,
Yeah, I want to get back into bed, and then we can relocate to another place, right? So because,
No, it's all right. Go ahead, Bill.
okay, but you got an old day. I don't want the kids.
No, not the kids. They don't.
all right, well, let's go ahead and, can you ask, and then I want to get Bill. So
Okay,
if you
fine.
got one more.
Could y'all change?
Okay, it's been 50 years since the Roswell crash, and you've already kind of described the mind of the military being exposed to this kind of weapons potential.
We call it the competitive edge of the Army.
Exactly, and that's what I want to talk about. Let's bring this up to date. I'll just ask it. Have we developed our own arsenal or fleet or flight command of flying discs? Does the United States military possess its own flying disc technology?
Well, I think one of the reasons we failed in flying disc technology, we weren't sure of the propulsion system or the guidance system. If you remember, and there's talk about the Coanda flight. Coanda, he flew a flying saucer and got it up in the air, and it crashed. He didn't have the guidance system. And I
No,
thought,
excuse me, that was one that we designed or one that
no,
we had
that was
captured?
described in Europe.
Mhm.
He was, and this thing talks about the Coanda effect.
Mhm.
It's a color, sort of.
Was it one of ours that we were
No,
trying
it
to
was,
test,
no,
or
it
was it
wasn't,
captured?
it wasn't ours.
Okay.
Now, we did experiments, and I know about, on flying saucers, the Avro one, for example.
Mhm.
But the thing is, we hadn't perfected the propulsion system or the guidance system. And I think the reason for that, because the extraterrestrial himself is the guidance system. And we never figured on that. We never thought that an extraterrestrial, a humanoid, could be a guidance system in himself.
Are we still trying to develop this, or have we just said, well, we can't do it, so we
I
just...
wish I knew. I didn't
Okay.
get in the, I don't know.
Okay.
I can't tell you that. Because once I left, a lot of times I talk to friends of mine that are in, and they tell me things, you know. But I can't set it down on paper like anything that I've worked on myself like here. No, I didn't work on that. But unfortunately, I wish I did know.
Were you ever at Camp Stewart
No.
in Atlanta, Georgia, or in Georgia as well?
Oh, I stopped there, but no
And
staying there.
did you ever run across a gentleman named Lieutenant Colonel Thomas M. Cheney, a surgeon?
No, I can't place that name.
That's all I have.
Malmstrom, that was in 1975 when they knocked
I
out?
think it was.
Yeah.
They knocked out the guidance system all
Right,
the time.
Loring, Malmstrom,
Can we
Minot,
change this?
Wordsmith.
Yeah, that cost quite a
Yeah.
lump of funds.
Oh, yeah, 97, 75 was a big year.
Yeah.
You know, you have very good grandchildren.
Okay.
Good. True crime writer, book producer, editor, publisher, and I've written a series of true crime books at Pocket Books, at Kensington Publishing, edited the McGraw-Hill personal computer programming encyclopedia at McGraw-Hill, a number of books on programming languages at New American Library and Scribner's, and actually invented, on a totally different subject, the television retrospective cookbook, Brady Bunch, Star Trek, Gilligan's Island, Beverly Hillbillies, Bewitched.
Cool. Cool. How did you get involved in writing this book or helping along with this book with the Colonel?
The Colonel and I began talking, about 2.5 years ago. There was a motion picture production company out in Los Angeles which was trying to work up some kind of property, some kind of television or theatrical feature film property having to do with the military and POWs, and Colonel Corso was consulting on that. Ultimately, we came together to talk about, as far as I was concerned, Rome, and I knew nothing about the Colonel's background in R&D and the Pentagon, just that he had been the area commander of Rome from 1944 to 1947. And there were a number of incidents that took place during that period that really interested me. during his command. And I knew about independent of the colonel. One was there were all these plots and counterplots. The big one was the communist plot, the Soviet plot to overthrow the new Italian government and replace it with a communist government by destabilizing the lira. And it was a huge counterfeiting plot. Well, it was Colonel Corso who helped expose that plot and save the new Italian government. There were other things that went on too. Another one which primarily interested me, most important, was the escape of thousands of Jewish war refugees from a displaced persons camp outside of Rome that were going to be deported to the Soviet Union or back to Poland. And the story was that our own OSS was helping the Russians because in that camp were members of the Stern Gang and the Irgun. And it was very important because in history, that's a very important event because somehow this group got liberated, were put on a freighter and under the noses of the British steamed into Palestine. What I found out was that Colonel Corso was the army officer who in Rome arranged for that escape with American troops on his own authority. Didn't ask permission, didn't go to the British, didn't go to the commanding general, basically liaised, as we say in the Army, a number of trucks, assigned the troops, told the elders of the camp, this is what's going to happen, you're getting out of here, took the list of the Irgun and Stern Gang members from the Italians and kept it himself, didn't give it to the British, didn't give it to the Russians, didn't give it to the OSS, kept the list and got these people out. And I wanted to do a book on that. Well, in our conversations, on and on, the colonel kept talking about White Sands, White Sands. I said, what happened at White Sands? He said, well, don't you know that I was one of a handful of American officers in NATO who had field authority for nuclear weapons, atomic warheads on my missiles. And I said, really? I didn't know that, because I knew that there were some officers that had them and didn't know what the criteria was. And he explained, you know, that on the Nikes that we were using in Germany, we had to have perfect aim. And my unit scored a perfect aim on drones. But I'll tell you what we did. We were able to explode our Nikes, simulated explosions, only a few miles above the ground, so nobody knew that the whole southern area of Germany that I commanded was nuclear capable, and we already had the atomic warheads. So in event of anything happening during the Cold War, an invasion, we could have stopped an invasion with our anti-aircraft missiles, but they didn't know they were really short-range ballistic missiles. The more we talked about White Sands, the more the colonel kept on saying, you know, we had these orders to shut down our radars. And every once in a while, my radars wouldn't shut down so fast. And every once in a while, I'd turn my radars on a little bit before I was supposed to. And that's when I began seeing these objects. And I didn't know what they were. Shooting across the sky, 4,000 miles an hour, 3,500 miles an hour. We didn't have anything like that. And gradually, finally, we were talking about the Warren Commission, Kennedy assassination, talking about roughly 1,200 pages of manuscript here. He said, you know, don't you, that lasers came from the crash at Roswell? I said, well, no, wait a minute, Colonel, you can't tell me that because I know that lasers were being developed at Columbia University in the late 1950s. And that's when the colonel showed me this monograph by General Britton about Army R&D. And he said to me, Bill, I want you to read this. Take time with it. Don't just skim it. Take time with it. And tell me what you see. And, of course, it's all about these inventions. It was about night vision goggles. It was about lasers. It was about the anti-missile missile. It was about directed energy beam weapons. And all of these monographs had something very similar. They all seem to start in the 1960s, even though we all know that Bell Labs was working on the transistors as early as the 1930s. We know that Shockley patented it in 47 and 48, the improved transistor. We know about Robert Noyce and how the sun rose on Silicon Valley in the 1950s. We know that. But the advanced versions of these, the implementations of these, were the 1960s. Something happened. It was like a black hole. You don't know there's a black hole because you could see it, You know there's a black hole because of its effect on the light around it. Well, that's what these reports were like. Something was there, and the effect of history, technological and developmental history, was somehow bent, changed by an unseen object. So finally, the colonel said to me, well, calls me up, company decision, told him what I just told you. He said, now it's time to find out the truth. And thus began the discussions of what happened in R&D in the 1960s.
In any of your discussions with the Colonel, did you ever discuss Pinamundo and the evacuation of all of that flying saucer, the possible flying saucer technology that the Germans had at the end of the war?
Yes, we talked about that. And we talked about the evacuation of the technology that the Germans had at the end of the war insofar as the scientists that wound up in the brain trust for Army R&D were exactly those scientists who were working on the material that the Germans had at the end of the war. We talked about the Horten flying wing. We talked about the German experiments. In fact, one of the things the Colonel mentioned was that in terms of the Foo Fighters, these strange objects, well, we thought they were German weapons. The Germans thought they were our weapons. Nobody really knew whose weapons they were unless it was a secret that the Germans had or a secret that we had. These things just suddenly appeared. So it seemed as though when you talk to people like Hermann Oberth, for example, who was one of the commanding officers, one of the commanding scientists at Peenemünde, they had come into possession of a certain kind of knowledge that we were yet to come into possession of because Hermann Oberth was making comments about, well, they were really time machines. They weren't really space machines. But he wasn't talking about appearances now. He was talking about what had happened at Peenemünde at the end of the war. So that, yes, a lot of this had come into our possession. It was almost as if, at the very end of the war, technology that the Germans had, which they were very closely guarding, that nobody knew where it came from, suddenly was making an appearance. And everybody, our side, their side, was very, very worried. In fact, there is a theory, we talk about it in the book a little bit, that one of the reasons the Germans had this desperate battle of the Bulge was to give them time to develop that technology, the vengeance weapons, V-1 and V-2. You know, don't you, there were V-1 rockets on launchers on German U-boats that Admiral Dönitz had sailed across the ocean in something called Operation Dewdrop to launch the final blow against American cities, timing it roughly in 1944 to try to force the Americans to sue for peace, fight to a standstill in Europe using the model of World War I, and so give the Germans the time to develop the kinds of weapons to push back across Europe and then eventually cross the ocean.
Does this also correlate, if your knowledge is that, of what Admiral Byrd did when he went to the Arctic and claimed to have seen, in your quotes,
1946.
Operation High Jump.
Yeah, that they saw a craft that could fly from pole to pole?
Yes. See, there were stories about, yes, Admiral Byrd, his story about this craft in 1946 that could fly from pole to pole correlates with the very appearance before Roswell of sightings of these kinds of craft. Where they came from, what they were, who piloted them, we simply don't know and didn't know. But you have to look at Roswell in the context of what had come before. That was the reason for the Army's concern. If a spacecraft, or any craft, let's not call it a spacecraft, let's say if something fell out of the sky and crashed in the desert, what would be the reason for the Army's overreaction? Well, the reason was this craft wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of an appearance that had made its appearance at the end of World War II. But it was also stories such as the one Admiral Byrd was telling about the strange craft, and if they were able, the Army was able to correlate that, they knew that something dramatic had changed, something new had made an appearance, something they were not going to release to the world because, quite frankly, they were scared to death.
I only have one other question for you, and in the course of R&D and in the course of back engineering a lot of the technology that was recovered on these spacecraft, was the world known about it? Did we share it with Japan? Did we share it with any other countries? And did we also say that if anything crashes in your property, we would like to have it?
Our sharing of the reverse engineered technology was through industry itself. And the answer is, a very short answer is yes, of course. But on the other hand, we didn't say, oh, this is alien technology that crashed at Roswell, we're going to give it to you for your industry so you can have the patents. We said the only way this can come out and be protected from, let's just say, predatory agencies within the government, which we talked about, and also foreign governments, was to get this under patent. But the U.S. government wasn't in a position to say, we're patenting this night vision device that came from Roswell. The only way to do that, it was a brilliant camouflage, was to say, at Fort Belvoir, there is an ongoing development of the German technology of tank and artillery mounted, or tank mounted, I think the British had artillery mounted, I'm not sure, but tank mounted, high-powered infrared night vision equipment. Totally impractical for handheld for the troops in the field. But knowing that Fort Belvoir was already working on these Nazi designs from World War II, General Trudeau, Colonel Corso, on the R&D, went to Fort Belvoir and said, you know, we have a development budget for just what you're working on, but what we also have are devices that we took from the end of World War II that have been in the Pentagon for a long time. Some single membrane-like lenses. Maybe you could use them. The word Roswell never entered into their discussions. It was, this is foreign technology. Yes, of course we could use this, Colonel, and along with it goes a multi-million-dollar, $50 million defense budget appropriation just for you if you can come up with just the right proposal for us. So in the paperwork between Army R&D, Fort Belvoir, IBM, Bell Labs, Monsanto, Dow, Hughes Aircraft, in that paperwork, these proposals, these plans, these designs, these sketches made their way as foreign technology. So yes, it was shared with the world, but through the auspice of licensed patents, through the normal licensing process from country to country under international patent law.
Anybody else?
I got one question, we'll kind of maybe, if you want to wrap it up. We're seeing this scenario, I want to put this to both of you. We're seeing this scenario from the limited perspective of Army intelligence. Was this same scenario going on with naval intelligence? Was it going on with Air Force intelligence? You've already mentioned the CIA. Like the CIA had its own agenda, which was separate from everybody else's. Are we seeing just one small slice of a pie that's a much bigger pie?
From what the Colonel explained to me, it went something like this, and the Colonel can certainly speak to this himself. Were there similar events going on in Navy R&D, in Air Force R&D, or in other agencies? Well, the short answer is Army R&D didn't know and didn't want to know.
Okay, stop it right there. Would these agencies, would Navy have shared with Army? Would Air Force have shared with Army and Navy? Would they have all shared together collectively at some point? Or do we, each service has its own in-house operation and they don't share anything about it?
Would services share with one another the technology they harvested from foreign resources, such as alien technology? It's a good question. Remember how the military operates. The Army is the Army, the Navy is the Navy, the Air Force is the Air Force. You'd love to say we're all brothers in the military and we share and share alike. That's all well and good until the time comes, and the Colonel can certainly speak to this, until the time comes to cut up the military development budget pie, and then the best of friends take out the military bayonets and stab each other in the back. Why? Why? There's a short answer to that. It's all money. There are only so few dollars, They can only go around to so few places, and if you've got a great deal on 130 or on a certain kind of millimeter artillery shell, are you going to go running to the Marines and say, here? No. You're going to try and cut the deal, and if the Marines want your shell, great, guys, come on under our aegis, under our auspice. Does the Air Force go running to the Navy and say, hey, guys, we have a design for a wonderful fighter, and you know what? We'll spend our development money so you can put it on an aircraft carrier. Nonsense. What they're going to say is we have a great design for a jet. If the Navy wants to spend the money, let the Navy spend the money for a carrier version. We're going to spend the money for an Air Force version, and they go to their respective friendly senators, their respective friendly Arms Appropriation Committee, their respective friendly administration, and they're going to argue like crazy for their budget. So no, I suspect that the Army didn't just hand over to the Navy and say, brother servicemen, look at this great pair of night vision goggles and this lens you got at RoSsWEll. We give it to you. What the Navy had, the Navy had. What the Air Force had, the Air Force had.
No, we have cross-fertilized.
Wouldn't a common threat, though, say an alien threat, if the Army and the Air Force, I'm sure the Air Force was aware of crash discs and this alien threat, wouldn't this common threat transcend individual jealousies, individual priorities, and wouldn't there be a consolidated effort to
Unfortunately, no.
construct some kind of defense system against
That's
these
your short
aliens?
answer. Yeah. Would there be a consolidated effort to this? The short answer is no. And the reason was nobody was walking around the Pentagon saying that flying saucers were about to attack the Earth. See, imagine living in a state of complete denial. How could you worry about a threat from outer space when flying saucers never crashed? You can't talk about RoSsWEll technology when nothing really happened at RoSsWEll at all. It was a weather balloon. You can't really talk about a threat from a foreign planet when there's no such thing as a threat from a planet far away. In other words, the denial itself was enough to have the services take what they had and develop it. Because let's face it, the first lieutenant colonel, captain, admiral, general who says, well, we have a common threat from outer space, so I'm going to take my R&D budget and devote it with the other services, that R&D organization would be cut to ribbons. Because remember, who's keeping a lid on this from 1947 on? The CIA. Why? Because the CIA doesn't want its bailiwick stepped on by a bunch of guys walking around in braids and uniform. The CIA wanted the budget. The CIA had a black budget. The Army didn't have a black budget. The Army had an appropriations budget, so the Army couldn't go black and say, we're not going to talk about this and we're going to develop secret things. The Army had to use good, old-fashioned, in-public R&D contracts under Senate oversight that anybody could see. So they had to look good. For the Army, the cover-up was the disclosure. The disclosure was the cover-up.
I have here an item along the same lines in small arms, from small weapons to 57 millimeter, and it happened just like Bill said, unfortunately. The Marines wanted their budget, the others wanted their budget, the Navy wanted their budget, they wanted the carriers, we wanted our weapons.
That's why
The
NASA
Air Force
came
wanted
along.
their airplanes. This happened constantly, so we didn't cost our life. We kept our, what we were doing, and we did it ourselves. You know what, when I took the, went to Fort Belvoir on the night viewing device, I took the budget. My orders from the general were, if you think they're doing a good job, and I took German scientists with me, give them the budget. I had it in my pocket. Everything was fine, they were doing a good job. And the colonel called me. He said, we were a little leery when we heard you were coming down. From my reputation that bad? And at the exit interview, I told him, you're doing a fine job here. In fact, look at my German scientists. They usually don't smile. And what they've seen here, they like. As a result, now instead of being a man that comes in and destroys everything, I'm going to act as Santa Claus. I have an envelope in my pocket. I'm going to hand it to you. $60 million budget. And the authority was, the general gave me the authority to give them the budget or not give them the budget. They were doing good. I told them, but there's a hitch to this budget. The war's heating up in Vietnam. Give us a night viewing device in 3 to 6 months. They did.
Thank you.
I know you got
My publicist is going to kill me.
but the crux to all this, one last, and if you could do plug
Hold up the book.
Kevin's book, right? The book already.
Go ahead.
But is there a bottom line? Is the government going to come out with a disclosure? Are we ever going to know the truth?
I think we're in the will the government ever come out with a disclosure? Will the day come when the government is going to step forward and say, ladies and gentlemen, we have a stunning announcement to make. We've kept this from you for a long time. The Colonel Corsos of the world, the Kevin Randalls of the world, the Stanton Freemans of the world, in their own way are all right. Will that day come? No. What I think will happen is something like this. We are in the process of disclosure. The way stories run, the way the truth comes out is the truth comes out on its own. Eventually, there will be a complete disclosure by default. Because what's going to happen is people are going to stop denying it. Not that a Bill Clinton or an Al Gore or a Newt Gingrich is going to step forward and say this is what really happened, but at some point, some official somewhere is going to say, well, you know, you asked me about this book, and gee, I guess in it, from the records I have, it's largely correct. And then gradually you'll see some records come out, and then you'll see some more records come out, and the government is going to say, if you want this disclosed, it's going to say this by default, disclose it yourself. And that's how the disclosure is going to be made. Not with a bang, but with a long, drawn-out whimper.
And if somebody else would like that, I'm trying to promote Clifford's book. If somebody else might want to know a little bit more about what's going on, would you suggest Clifford's book?
What I'd say, if somebody were really interested in finding out what's in the government records now, because he just said it was going to come out with disclosures, the disclosures are there. The truth is there. In Clifford Stone's first book, Let the Evidence Speak for Itself, and in his revised edition, UFOs, a real documentary evidence of government cover-up of UFOs, what Cliff Stone has managed to do is to have the largest single repository of disclosed freedom of information documents in between two covers of anybody else. For anybody who's serious about researching UFOs and government documents, that's the first place to go, is Cliff Stone's book.
In my case, I say don't look at the name on the book, Corso. Look at the contents of that book. Just read the contents. Forget the names on the cover. And make your decision on what's in the book.
Good.
Thank you.
Well, I think...
So we'll have plenty of opportunities to visit with him, but this is kind of a closed session here, if you will. So, Colonel Corso, if you'd like to step up, sir? Yes, sir. Might be best, sir.
This is Bill Burns, my co-author. Well, the first thing I want to say, I was asked if I had anything to say. The book, we tried to write it as a truth as I lived it and saw it. And people question me, and I always ask the question, were you there with us? If you were there, you can criticize. If you weren't there, then the book is true. Now, I was also asked, what message do I want to convey, the first message? The first message I would like to convey is I don't know why a lot of these things are going on, the announcements made, the televisions and so forth, that's beyond me. And I won't criticize the other forces.
Louder, please.
Can't hear you.
Microphone.
Your mic's
not on.
No, there's no amplification on the microphone. You just have to speak.
Do I have to speak?
Right.
Oh, yeah, I'll move away from that then. Well, tell me if you can hear me back there. I was asked why...
We can leave it up.
Many reasons I wrote this, but I'll tell you why. I've been approached by many young people. One, for example, my nephew is a research director.
There's no amplification.
No, just for me.
Research director, they call it. He's been asking me, he says, Uncle, well, we won't panic. We won't go our hell, shoot our breast. We want to know these things. Tell us. And and what I use on that to prove that his words were right, I was very proud to say I commanded a combat battalion. I had 1,500 soldiers. The average age was 19 and a half. Those boys didn't panic. They fought the greatest armies the world's ever seen and defeated them and destroyed them. Those boys didn't panic. And the young people today are not going to panic. Let's tell them the truth. They want to hear it. They keep asking me, tell us the truth. Of course, for many years I couldn't talk. My own family, my son sitting back there, he criticized me. He said, 35 years you waited and you didn't say anything. That's right. I had an oath with the general until he died that I couldn't speak. And we had an oath among ourselves that we were going to talk about this. We succeeded in our mission. We failed in some things we were doing, but we succeeded in quite a bit. So about 3 years ago when the general died, my 3 little grandsons who were sitting back there, they came to me and they said, Granddad, what did you do during the war? So I figured, well, if nothing else, I better start writing and leave these little boys a legacy. Because I'm 82 years old now. And I started to write, and from that, this evolved. Because this is what the people and the young people want to hear. And I wrote this within mind, tell it to them. They're the ones who are going to carry on after us. They want to know. And I'll tell you, the other people are going to come forward. I've had phone calls already from friends of mine. If they will, at the right time, they'll start to talk. I had a lieutenant general friend of mine, we were colonels together. He called me and he said, Phil, I know when you headed the team on the line in Adams in medals, and you had German scientists, I know all about that. And he knows about it. So people are going to come forward to start confronting it now that it's out. One interview yesterday, I was told that somebody called you a kook. So, well, I expected that. But I'll tell you one thing. First, let them challenge me personally if they have a nerve to do it. Number 2, I told them, I'm in very good company. Let me name them. General Marshall believed, General MacArthur believed, even Jimmy Carter believed, Von Braun believed, General Trudeau believed, and I can go on and on. I'm in the great Canadian genius, Wilbur Smith. I had the privilege of talking to him quite at length. He died in 1962 of cancer. He knew all them. And I told him, these people, I'm in good company. If these are all kooks, that's the company I want to stay in. Because these are reliable, good people who knew what they were doing. And that's part of the story of why this was done and why I wrote this. Now, if you don't have questions, I'll be glad to take questions.
Did you have any pressure from anyone in the military or government not to publish this book?
No, not at all. In fact, I welcome pressure, but nobody.
Colonel, what was the reasoning and what is the maintained reasoning behind the government attitude toward keeping this secret?
Tell you the truth, I can't figure this out. I was on the White House staff. I was on the high special office. Why they do things like this, I don't know. I don't criticize the Air Force. I fought with them in Korea. I have a lot of friends in the Air Force. Why they hire us to make these decisions and put out statements like this, I wish I knew. I don't know. One day, way in the past, I asked, I don't want to call him stupid, but I asked General Trudeau, how do you fight stupidity? You know what his answer was? When you find out, Phil, let me know. He said, because I don't know. I don't know why they do things like that. They don't have to do these things. They can tell the truth, and everyone will be happy and really pleased and praise them.
Concerning aliens and UFOs. My only question concerning the book is, for violating your oath of national security secrecy.
They weren't. It's not classified. Everything is not classified. Some things that I know are classified. This was not classified. And it's been over 30 years ago. It was 35 years ago that this happened. And there's no security breach in here. These were fed to industry, they were fed to scientists. All this was known, only it wasn't known in a form where we gave an artifact to somebody. We gave them research and development projects. There's no security breach in here at all. And I had all the clearances. I know my job was security for quite a while. I was trained by the British in MI-19 in intelligence. And I know security, and I know what is secure and what isn't. This was not. There's no security in here. This is, the public should know this.
Why is there such a fear for disclosure by other military personnel?
I'm just, as the gentleman, I don't know. Now, for security, in here is an appendix on Project Horizon. We did Project Horizon in 1959. It was putting a military colony on the moon. Some of the best minds in the country worked on this. Von Braun and his German scientists worked on this. This was classified. It was secret. I declassified it under General Trudeau's authority. But when I started to write the book about 2 years ago, I wrote to the Corps of Engineers. And they sent me, I told them where it was and what it was, and they sent it to me. In fact, when I went to see Senator John Glenn, I had to give, he wanted a copy. This is only 50 pages in here. The actual report is 310 pages. The moon lander's in here. Mind, this was done in 59 and 60 and 61. And that was secret. I think you will see some of the marks on that secret. And I was one of the classifiers for the general.
Sir, would you address the comment that you made on Dateline about a time machine?
Well, no, you have to go back there and look at certain things, like the Philadelphia experiment. This was a discussion, and like the book mentions, I discussed that item with Herman Obert. Obert, if you gentlemen don't know who it is, he was in charge of Mundo in Germany. He was one of our boss. And I discussed this with him. The time machine is really in that category. Also, the British were working on time machines. The British were good. They got the Mundo first before we did. And that's really the time machine. It was nothing of great importance. Now, possibly in the future we will know more. I've talked with some scientists about this. Even Einstein says that it's possible. So it's possible, and I have to leave it there now. I can't fill you in anymore.
But you made it sound as if you had seen it.
Time machine?
Yeah. That it existed in the...
No, some people are thinking that. I asked some scientists what they thought. They said, well, it could be vision, it could be... they didn't know. And I know for sure.
I'm just referring to your remark on that television magazine program.
Well, I don't
You
know.
made it sound as if, would you like to hear about the time machine?
Yeah, I didn't know what that was, you know. I gave you that explanation of the one that I have, that I made. This was the explanation. Now, you got to read the Philadelphia experiment on what happened there. I had the privilege of knowing Admiral Arleigh Burke, who was Chief of Naval Operations at the time. He was in charge of a think tank.
Excuse me, what was that name, sir?
Arleigh Burke, Admiral Arleigh Burke. He was in charge of a think tank at Georgetown University when I did it. And we discussed the Philadelphia experiment, and there's some indication that possibly it was there. Yes.
By discussing the crash at Roswell, there's other indications that there were a number of different crashes throughout Arizona and New Mexico during the same period of time. Do you know anything about those?
Yes, I know something about those, and also you can expand that. There were crashes all over the world.
Do you have any idea why those crashes were occurring in 1947 in and around
I
this
have
area?
some theories that...
Were we bringing them down?
Remember, I commanded the range, the Army Missile Prime Range right down here in White Sands in 1957-58. I picked up actual objects in my own radars. I had principally radars that could walk on the targets. On my own radars, I was picking up objects traveling 3,000 or 4,000 miles an hour. And the boys would report back to me that once it accelerates, the lock would break. The radar couldn't hold it. And so every time that would happen, I would call them and send me the tape. Because we had tapes which took the whole fine sequence and recorded it so we could go back later. I was going to send me the tapes, and I checked them myself. And it was accurate. There were items traveling that fast. Now, possibly they were a little bit afraid of our radars. Because we had, for the time, we had pretty powerful radars. The radars that I had, the newspaper men came to visit me. I used to tell them, gentlemen, you can take all the pictures you want, but if you have flash balls in your pocket, please take them out. I can't turn the radars on if you do, because once I turn them on, they'll pop in your pocket, because those radars are powerful.
Was that something similar to Project Diana that was being used in 47?
I really don't know. Okay, I can go back to that. I was a full audience, but before that I just came from the Middle East.
Colonel Corso, General Douglas MacArthur made some statements after his dismissal from Korea that he felt the next great war would be an interplanetary war that we would be involved in. Would you care to comment on that?
He said that twice. MacArthur headed a unit in Korea when I was there, on keeping track of projects, of UFO projects that were flying around. Then he got disgusted with CIA and the government. Well, the CIA just organized him. He got anxious. He got disgusted with them and wiped it out. He said, I don't want anything to do with it. And then he told General Marshall that. Actually, he got disgusted with our people back here, not with the UFOs. He was watching. He was a believer.
Was it a perceived threat at that time?
Yes, it was pretty accurate. I saw something. I was chief of the special projects director of the Far East Intelligence Division, the Far East Commander at the time.
Are there extraterrestrial intelligences that we would perceive at this time as an enemy?
Yes, because when I had the clearances, I had almost all the clearances there were to have, and I had one NSA clearance. And we were aware of radio coming from outer space, radio people, and they were very organized. They weren't space noise or disorganized, so we were never able to break the code, decode it, let's look at. But they were organized. Radio coming from outer space. We could never pin it down where they were coming from or what they were trying to say. And then the project signed, and they spent a lot of money on that, and they still are.
In the 50 years since Roswell, do you feel like our government or the Pentagon has tried to get technology to put us potentially on par with extraterrestrial military
we
threat?
succeeded in part of that. I have some pamphlets, which I've never shown, written by General Britain that he was at the Army Materiel Command, one of the General Trudeau's better friends, and he discusses laser, which I think was our number 2 in importance project. And we made, that started in 1960. General Beach, who succeeded General Trudeau, he had made that statement. And all the pamphlets I have at the Army sent me lately go back to 61 on laser. And we had a lot of developments. We made some pretty strong developments. We have to be awful careful with the laser, though. The weapons they're making, they can pop your eyes in a second. They just pop and go blind. And we made some radar beams that were pretty powerful, lasers that were pretty powerful. Speed, no lead time. They were, the beams up there have 300,000 kilometers a second. There was no lead time. A plane flying the speed of sound, the target would hit instantaneous. It would move 1 centimeter, 1 millimeter, by the time that it was hit by the ray.
Is that the purpose of Star Wars, the Star Wars umbrella that we have?
Yes. In fact, I was the first project officer on the intermissile missile. General Trudeau appointed me. He said, "You take over." I told him, "General, don't tell me you're too busy. You do it, and they recommend somebody later after we start." And we used, by the way, in the guidance systems, we tried to use some of what we thought was in the brain of the extraterrestrial, because they had 4 loads. And the missiles were, that was some of what we were trying to do. We succeeded in a way.
Do you feel at this time, do you feel like we're reasonably on par with any threatening extraterrestrials?
Oh, yes. Now, something that's classified, we had atomic weapons at the time.
Right.
General Trudeau in his memoirs said we could drop them in a bucket. That's how small they were. And as far as I'm concerned, all the information I've seen, the extraterrestrials feared the atomic. Because remember, one of the main areas that they were looking for was the Los Alamos in this area. My degree area, my command range, was only a few miles from the Trinity site. I was right in that area. And I think the extraterrestrials maybe know. Now, in research and development, when we worked this, we had a lot of people asked, were they hostile or were they friendly? We never quite came to the right conclusion that they were hostile or friendly. But what we did, the way we worked, and General Trudeau's, what he said, just in case we won't be caught, help us. So we oriented in that direction. That was his motto, just in case. There. And they performed a lot of hostile acts. If you look at the record, there's a lot of people, and there were weapon ranges, and a lot of damage, and a lot of people were killed.
Yeah. Sir, could you tell us a little more about some of the hostile acts that you were aware of upon some of our pilots?
Well, they fly close aircraft, they downed some aircraft. They went to Maelstrom Air Force Base, and a UFO flew over, and it deadened the guidance system, and every missile we had there was large return, Minuteman missiles. Every guidance system, the same guidance system, and every one was out of commission. And there were quite a few incidents of that type. Let's take the Russians at Volkanor, the Cosmodrome. A UFO came over for 14 seconds. Their steel towers fell apart. The welds and what was holding together all the rivets just came apart. Like Wilbur Smith told me that this, what that affected, it destroy the nuclear binding. And he was an expert on that. His government treated him. Old guy, I always thought rotten. And this man was a genius as far as I'm concerned. I had one long session with him, and I was supposed to go up and see him in Mayboro on Lake Ontario. And I waited because I was busy in 1962. I decided to go up, and I picked the telephone up and called him. And they told me Mrs. Smith died of cancer, and I never got to talk to him. So the general made me sit down and write everything that I knew, the conversation he and I had. And I wrote it up in hand to the general.
Sure. Could you tell us what you know about Area 51? Or is that such a place called Area 51?
Well, there was an area when I was there, Area 51. In fact, we always knew it as an atomic overflight, prohibited from overflight, because it was an atomic area. I know a little bit about what's being done there, but a lot of the stories are exaggerated. Not that much was being done, but they didn't. They were doing some developments, and naturally, armament developments and developments like that are kept quiet. In fact, we knew from good information that Stalin gave orders to some of his top people to find out everything that happened at Roswell. We knew that the communists were after this information. So when we developed weapons, when we developed aircraft, it had to be kept quiet, because the Russians wanted it worse nothing. And even the Germans told me, I had 2 German scientists on my team when going to. They told me that also in the early days they were looking for information of the same type. And in fact, in my book, there's a picture in here of myself and General Trudeau. Mr. O'Connor was the White House with me, was a Soviet expert, and Victor Fadai. Victor Fadai he spoke Russian, and he was from the Library of Congress. He was one of the head men there. And we became great friends. And when Victor was going to Moscow, so I gave him a list of questions. I told him, would you ask your KGB general that you know these questions? So when he showed him, he came back and told me, he said, I showed him the questions, he looked at them, and he said, I know what you're looking for. And it's in the book, and his answer was, you want me killed? The KGB general said that. Because we knew that the Russians were working on this thing. And we knew that the Germans were working on it. Same thing. There was UFOs going down over there. Yeah.
This is to Bill. Bill, how did you get involved in this? How did you get to co-author, co-work with the Colonel?
The Colonel, when he was writing his memoirs, wrote a very long piece in which the material that eventually became this book was incorporated into a larger story of my career in intelligence, and my career in the military. We were originally working on the story of Colonel Corso's stint as the area commander in Rome in the final year of World War II and the months afterwards. And gradually, as we began talking about what Army intelligence did, what happened in Army R&D, what the Colonel's responsibilities were with respect to technology that came into R&D from other sources, one day he said, I've never told you this, but here's something I'd like you to read. And he gave me the General Britain history of all these developments that he just referred to a little while ago. And they all had this one aspect to them which was very interesting. All of them seemed to point to this golden age of R&D development from the early 60s through the middle 60s, acknowledging there had been some technological work done in the 50s, and in the case of the transistor, obviously, in the 1940s. But the flowering, the completion of technology took place in the 1960s. And this was a few years ago, and the Colonel said, so what do you see in all this? And I said, well, what I see is somehow in the 1960s, a lot of things got made very fast. And he said, there's a reason for it. Let me tell you why. And so began the story of what was really going on under the, not the guise, but under the agenda of Army R&D. It conformed to, the Colonel explains, I think it's in the book, the Colonel explained that at that time, in order to study technology that may be from this planet, may not be from this planet, maybe from the Russians, maybe from the Italians, The Foreign Technology Division of Army Research and Development was the agency where the development started. And so under that aegis, under that auspice, is a better term to use, came this RoSsWEll material. And so we started working on another book entirely, more about Rome, and more about what happened in the final years of occupation and the NKVD units operating in Rome and the Gestapo units operating in Rome, British intelligence, American intelligence, OSS fighting the military. We're still going to do that book. But as our discussions about this long line of intelligence developed, it developed partly also because why were the CIA and the military intelligence services always at odds, and you know that from the history of this thing. Why were there always different intelligence reports? Why were there these conflicts? Who was fighting whom and why? This material was at close to the center of it. And that's how the story developed. And we said, gee, you know, it's 2 years ago now. And we're saying, do we have time to write a book about this, given the fact that the 50th anniversary of the incident at RoSsWEll, this was in '95, is basically 2 years away. So I'm a Simon & Schuster author. I have a list of true crime titles there. And so I called up an editor with Simon & Schuster that I've worked with, and he said, it sounds like a great idea. Can you guys get your heads together to do this book in time? So we worked very hard. We did, and that's why we have the book now. So it really was a project from a few years ago that when we decided to do it, we really had to speed it up to have the book come out at this time.
General Trudeau told me that Compton Bill's he told me one day, he said, Bill, it took 5 years to develop the transistor where it is now. Because I had orders from him to look around industry and scientists who were doing this type of work and infuse our knowledge into these, and finance them also. His statement was, it took us 5 years to develop the transistor and integrated circuit. It should have taken us 250 years. Well, his exact words to me.
The Army themselves did the work on the transistor and then brought it to the
Well,
private government.
we didn't care who did the work, because once we infused it in there, we had to find units who were working close to this, who knew the scientists, and we would finance them. And we encouraged them, and it's in the pamphlet that Bill mentioned, to take the patents, take credit. We couldn't take any credit on patents for the military. We encouraged them to take these and treat them as they belong to them. In fact, later on, I went with Thurman to NASA, and we discussed with the head of NASA the Tech Brief program, which is a similar program. Give it to the people and give them the patents also. And that's what we did at the time.
Colonel, if I could interrupt, what we're going to do is, since the Colonel will be speaking tonight at the UFO Museum, their sound system is a little bit more accommodating than ours. We're going to go ahead and end the news conference at this time, provide you some one-on-one time if you'd like to speak with the Colonel about some specific issues, and I believe you're going to provide a response.
I just want to also address something that you raised. One of the issues that's going on was John Hockenberry had read the book, and in the book is a section in which Herman Ober had mentioned to the other scientists who were working with Army R&D, Colonel Corso and General Trudeau, that in order for spacecraft to traverse the kinds of distances they had to travel, occurring from light years and light years away, they weren't just spaceships. That was a misnomer. He suggested that the Germans thought that they were actually time machines that were able to eclipse vast distances of time as well as space. And so that's what John Hockenberry was asking about. And when the Colonel and John were pointing at the craft at the far end of the exhibit, that was the genesis of that conversation. And that's why the time machine was mentioned, and that was why when the story went over time, because it was so long, so involved, so complicated, they couldn't fit into that segment. And that was the whole thing.
I discussed this with Professor Obert, or the German professor. In fact, on my team, where I investigated, the generals made me head of the team, of aligning atoms and metals. And I had two German scientists on my team were bronze people and Army engineers. And every once in a while, subjects like this would come up. We discussed many topics. And these were actual, and Hobart was, I'd say, the foremost expert in the world on rockets. In fact, he rated with Goddard, who was right in this area in NOA. So it was discussed. We discussed not only this, but we discussed many other items also. We discussed Einstein's theories of zero travel in space. So these things were discussed. But the items that we actually did and fit out to industry so that the people could have what we call applied engineering. And Dr. Teller was still living, was with us on applied engineering. We went to look for industries and scientists who had started these projects, and then we gave them infusion. And infusion was actual R&D projects, which we funded with our funds. So many subjects at the time came up, similar subjects, but certain items were taken to put out, like, and put it in industry, and give to the people. Laser, for example, is one of them, fiber optics. And these were the items that were constantly discussed. And the line on the items, maybe people want to know about, I had a piece of metal. And later on, Wilbur Smith, the Canadian genius, brought me another piece of metal. And he got them on his also. And the atoms were aligned in it. This piece of metal, was the size of a postcard, was so hard and so strong you couldn't bend it, it was paper thin, couldn't put a bullet through it, you couldn't scratch it. And the general told me, when he gave me a meeting here with the team to look into this, he said, Bill, this is bigger than Los Alamos. That's what he thought about it. Well, unfortunately, we didn't succeed. We tried, we funded universities, but we did never succeed because spaceships didn't make the crowd light as a feather. It would, in fact, we discussed this, it would make all our weapons obsolete. This was, and this team, I was head of that team, but I hate to say this, we did not succeed in doing it. It was too much for us.